I hope there's listeners out there that are thinking like, I'd like to start something, but man, I just don't know what my first 3, 4, 5 steps are. Go read the book, or come to 43 North, or go to Launch New York, or go. There's people out there that would love to hold your hand and just give you a spirit of what it's like, and it's probably not as scary as you think it is.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever you may be listening, and welcome to Latitude, the 43 North podcast. I'm your host, Nate Benson, Director of Media and Public Relations here at 43 North, and we are fully recovered now from the 43 North finals just a couple weeks ago. Make sure you head on over to the 43 North YouTube channel and watch the full show if you missed it, and we'll also be posting up the pitches from the 18 finalists in the next coming week or so, so it's going to be fantastic. But moving on to today's show, I am absolutely thrilled that we have one of the 43 North Finals judges, Chris Heivly, in the studio today on the podcast. And Chris's resume speaks for itself, but let me just kind of go through some of the bullet points for you. He's an entrepreneur in residence at Techstars. He's the managing partner of the Startup Factory in Durham, North Carolina. He is also the founder of Mapquest. You may have heard of Mapquest. I know back in my day, I'm aging myself now, when I wanted to go somewhere, I had to go to the computer, print out directions on Mapquest, and then fumble through the papers in my Dodge Neon, my 96 Dodge Neon, mind you, and get to where I was going. So I'm really thrilled to have Chris on the episode this week. We talk about the 43 North Finals and try to get a little bit of perspective of what it's like to be a judge on stage during the 43 North Finals, and also talk about the founding of Mapquest and what Chris has been up to since, and also why he's called the Startup Whisperer. Chris is full of stories. I wish we had more time with him, but we only had a half hour of free time this week to chat with him, so I'm not going to waste another minute of me talking, and let's jump right into this week's episode with Chris Heivly. Chris Heivly, how are you today?
I am peachy keen.
Have
you ever heard that before?
Once or twice.
Yeah, from your grandparents?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So right out of the gate, I won't, go through your litany of resume notches on your job belt, so to speak. It speaks for itself. That being said, how did a cartographer get lost going to a restaurant in Buffalo?
I blame it totally. Well, it's more than lost. It's getting on a bridge to Canada.
To a whole new country.
To a whole new country. I blame it on my compatriot who had Google Maps.
Oh, see? No, she was just using Mapquest.
Yeah.
We'll talk about Mapquest in a minute. You're here in Buffalo. You just wrapped up helping us out with the 43 North Finals. Tell me a little bit about what that experience was like as kind of one of our celebrity judges.
Sure. Well, in doing what I've done over the last 10, 15 years, being involved in entrepreneurship, investing, community building, do a lot on the speaking tour. I've been to, probably hundreds of these kind of events. And what I'll share with you is that if anybody would have told me, hey, would you be a judge for an event? It'll be 3 hours long, and you'll be on stage, and you'll get 3 minutes of questions with 10 or whatever companies. I would have been like, shoot me in the head, right? Like
pass.
3
Hard
hours.
Pass. Yeah.
But I'll tell you, the energy in the room, and the energy in the audience, and the energy on stage, and call it production values that kind of help support that. But it was a lot of fun, and I wanted more, not less. So that doesn't happen too often.
Wow. What's kind of the mindset of being a judge at that caliber, or that late rather, in the kind of a competition like that? Because it's kind of like in your hands and 6 other judges' hands at that point. Whether these companies are going to make it potentially, or that could be the end of the road for some of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been an investor off and on for 10 or 15 years, and so that dynamic has existed in my head for a while. And to be honest with you, I don't actually think about like that I have their life or the company's life in their hand. I mean, the factors that make a company successful are varied and many, and so I'm just one piece of that. The thing. So the good part that you get to do is you get to try to influence them. Yeah. The bad part is I am sharing the stage with 7 other judges, and I don't get to do this alone. Yeah. But you just try to ask a question or two. You're trying to give them provide empathy for their position. They're sitting in front of 3,000 people, and 7 people are judging them on stage. But I'm trying to help them. I'm trying to help them by asking a great question, maybe seeing if they thought about something, and I'm also trying to give them physical cues that this is safe. You'll survive.
Now, you're known as the Startup Whisperer, and I'll get to that nickname momentarily, but you're also known kind of as like a community builder across the country in the entrepreneurial landscape, so to speak. Buffalo's early on in this kind of resurgence of innovation and entrepreneurship and startups. After spending a few weeks here, what's your takeaway been about just what's happening in the landscape here?
Tons of potential, some good work done over the last 3 years. There's some momentum being created and happening, and it's I've experienced this in a similar, if not smaller, community in kind of Durham, part of the Raleigh-Durham community, North Carolina. It's just so much fun to be part of something that's kind of ascending than the opposite, right? So I know Buffalo as a kind of an old manufacturing town has kind of had its ups and downs, not unlike a lot of communities here in the Northeast. But you kind of feel that there's a drumbeat happening, right? And I've been here 3 or 4 times over the last few months. And getting to talk to, first of all, anytime you can put me in front of entrepreneurs, I'm happy, right? So just, feeling the energy, feeling the passion that people have to kind of maybe kind of create a startup community here that will be a very viable piece of the economy. That's pretty cool, and I'm seeing it. I'm feeling it, seeing it. I think we've talked to probably 20 to 25 people just this week, and yeah.
So far, so good, huh?
So far, so good, yeah.
So kind of going back...
by the way, it's a 20-year journey that restarts every day.
Yeah.
Right? And it's somewhat almost generational. So, it's old guard kind of slowing down and kind of handing it off. It's new whippersnappers, Yes, I am your grandparent, right? Peachy Keen and whippersnappers.
That's right, kids. Have a caramello.
Yeah. So you can see kind of not a changing of the guard. You see kind of new energy. That's what it takes, right? So
kind of going back, you started your career off in cartography. You worked at the State Department, correct?
That's correct.
What out of college did you kind of land right into that?
Yeah, I was in graduate school down at University of South Carolina. I got a master's degree in geography, though I'm the worst geographer you've ever met. I love computers and I love maps. I'm going to show my age, or at least my age cohort. This was in the early 80s in graduate school. You do the math. There's not a lot of computing being applied to things outside of pure computers in computer science. So to be a geographer who knew how to write code in the early 80s was pretty special. And I sometimes joke that make me one of the first map geeks.
Right.
If you get that.
Yeah.
Chuckle. But there weren't, by the way, the idea of starting a company was not even I didn't even know what an entrepreneur was. So that wasn't even an option for me. So I was going to go somewhere and, I had some typically a lot of innovation starts in the government. Yeah. And so, we had a little mapping division inside the State Department. And would you come in and help us do this better, faster, quicker, using these computers? So that was kind of the gig.
So you're working at the State Department. How did you then transition into kind of an entrepreneurship in a startup? And we'll get to Mapquest in a second, because realistically, once you get that cushy government job, you could probably have had that for life, and then retired at a pension at 55, and that's the dream gig for a lot of people, right?
That's what I hear for those mere mortals. Yeah. But I guess I'm a wacky guy.
Wired differently, huh?
Wired differently, and so even though I didn't know what an entrepreneur was, and I wasn't maybe technically an entrepreneur, the next kind of 10 to 15 years are, sometimes people call it an intrapreneur, right? Which is you're being very entrepreneurial inside a larger entity. I was doing all the things you do as an entrepreneur inside the State Department. I was breaking down walls. I was seeking funding. I was trying to build product and pushing the edge of the envelope. So I was very entrepreneurial, even though it doesn't look like it when you say I work for the U.S. State Department.
Right.
And the same thing happened when I what I found out, and when I started getting some personal press about creating computer mapping technology and how do you do this, then a bunch of kind of cartography companies started saying, like, what is this thing? We're still basically making, the National Geographic Atlas by hand, right? Like, how do we use these computer things? So that was my kind of drift into private industry was, well, now I can do it faster, like less government red tape, right? And do it for private. So that was my transition, but still the same thing. How do I push the envelope? How do I create new product?
In my research prior to the interview, I was looking into the history of Mapquest, and I had no idea that kind of the roots of that code were developed right here at University of Buffalo, correct? With Barry Glick.
With Barry Glick as a university. I forgot about that, by the way. In fact, I need to tell him what I'm doing. So he got a PhD here. He was down in D.C. at the time. And, he had done some professoring and some other things, but he was working, he had a little consulting company. A lot of the contracts are with federal government, right? That's why he's in D.C. And we found each other. And eventually we did a joint venture together on a product that basically went into the auto clubs, AAA, but people know AAA, but there was 14 other auto clubs. And we did a joint venture. He brought some technology. We bought some mapping and some heft in terms of the mapping company that I was with, which was called Donnelly Cartographic Services. Right. And
very, very professional.
Yeah, very, but we went and sold that, built a product that basically put in the back office of these auto clubs could make triptychs, right? How do I get from Buffalo to Orlando to go to Disneyland? How do we going to go there? Circa late 90s and circa late 80s, early 90s. And so that ended up becoming a very good little joint venture. And then I convinced our parent company to bring Barry on board and let's kind of blow out this whole kind of digital division. And so, we worked together on that.
I mean, I'm aging myself now. When I was just starting out driving, that was the first thing you did when you tried to sneak the car out of your mom and dad's garage. Was the quickest way was to find on Mapquest to point A to point B, because I couldn't read a road sign to save my ass. Right. So,
and then you printed it out.
And then I've got 10 pages of directions in front of me, and this is 99 2000 era.
Right. Well, we launched Mapquest. So the kind of the little quick history of Mapquest is, so we have this mapping division, making maps for every publisher that you can imagine. National Geographic, we made their atlases for them. Every textbook, history textbook that has a little Civil War map, we're doing all that. Back in the day, and if you're over 25, you don't even know that this exists, but there used to be the thing called a telephone book, right, that showed up every, at your house once a year. Well, the front end of that had a lot of maps, right? So we did all of that. But we were, I was kind of the guy that was in kind of making the migration to more, not just how to make those maps digitally, but what other products and what other kind of avenues could we explore. I told you about that joint venture with the PC and the laser printer in the back office. I then built CD-ROMs, because that was the next thing in the early 90s. And after the CD-ROMs, we did an Apple Newton product, which was the first handheld. Again, if you're over probably 30 or 35, you don't even remember that. It's like the only Apple product that failed. But it was way too before its time. And the next thing was the internet. So that was we just followed the technology, and we launched Mapquest in February of 1996. Wow. One of the first big brands.
I mean, it was a brand name. I mean, it was go Mapquest it before you leave the house for a trip. I mean, I distinctly remember growing up with that phrase. So
very cool.
Sold to AOL for $1.2 billion, right?
First taken public. And then, and by then I was off the board, and the company's doing. They needed adults, and that kind of thing. So first taken public, and then AOL bought it off the public markets within a year, I think.
What was the atmosphere like? I mean, because this is mid '90s, the kind of the Wild West of Silicon Valley and startups and things like that. So kind of get us into that mindset of what it was like. Was it as much of a Wild West as it's been depicted in kind of television and movies, or was it? Kind of walk us through that.
Yeah. It actually wasn't, because much to your listeners' surprise, Lancaster. We baked Mapquest in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. If you know anything about Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it's home to 55,000 Amish people. We weren't a Silicon Valley place. By the way, we were spending a lot of time in California, especially around CD-ROMs and had customers for our other business, mapping business, which is more enterprise mapping technology, to Apple Computer and all different kinds of. So we kind of had a Silicon Valley kind of experience and knowledge, but we were,
but also shielded from it.
And without all the kind of the craziness and I think the chaos and the kind of the media depiction of like the Valley. We'd go back to Lancaster, Pennsylvania with 50 cartographers, and now, a few years in, up to 50, software developers and product managers and, typical company stuff. And I say to people, I think we didn't know better. Maybe we were naive, but the naivete worked for us because we're just like, well, no one else is doing this. We might as well do it.
What's a holiday party with 50 cartographers and 50 software developers like?
I think we already know. That being said, we had a really fun crew. I remember I hosted the Christmas party for many years until we got to a place where my house couldn't support it. And then and remember we went and got a hall to do it in. And I remember that that first year we had a hall, and I think they did this for a few years before I had moved on. We formed by the way, the name of the company before we launched Mapquest was called Geosystems. And so we put a band together to play at our own gig called the Geo Dogs.
Of course, obviously.
So that's the answer, like how geeky the party was.
It's a real rager.
It was a rager.
What were some of the lessons you took away? I mean, again, coming from, you really didn't have an idea of getting into quote-unquote entrepreneurship out of college. You worked at the State Department. This is your first gig, becomes highly successful, which that in itself is a huge achievement and rare. So many startups fail fairly quickly. What were some of those big takeaways after, you then moved on out of Mapquest, and what are you reflecting on of lessons learned?
That it's really hard. And when you have success, you're like, well, let's just do it again. And
because it's easy, it's a piece of cake.
And that there's so many factors and variables that go into success, many of which you have no control over. I mean, you try to control as many as possible, and I think the ones who are really good entrepreneurs, especially serial entrepreneurs, find a way to gain as much control over the arc or the trajectory of the company than not. But it's some luck, it's timing, it's, because there's plenty of stuff we see that's too early, plenty of stuff that's too late, right? So there's just so many factors. And I think, maybe also with age comes, a little bit of humility, which I think we always had, especially kind of coming out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that, you just put your head down, you do hard work, and sometimes you have unbelievable outcomes, and sometimes you have modest outcomes, and sometimes you crap the bed, right? So, it's not you, it's not a person, many times. So rinse and repeat, enjoy the journey. I don't know. I'm sounding like your dad now. So
my dad is full of wise advice. So that's a compliment, of course. So how did you get the name Startup Whisperer? The nickname, was it self-inflicted, or was it given upon you? No,
you can't give yourself your own nicknames. That's just,
you never know.
That's just really
We've had people on the podcast who've nicknamed themselves.
Yeah. Well, by the way, a funny story I just thought about. My dad moved around a lot with his dad all through the Northeast. And my dad was kind of a scrawny little guy and probably a scrawny little kid. And his sister told me the story that when they moved one time, when he moved in, he started meeting people. He's like, by the way, he made up his own nickname. He didn't tell them this. And he wanted to be called Tiger.
Just cuz?
Yeah, I don't even. There's so many layers to that.
Call me
Tiger.
Yeah. How'd you get that? You don't want to know.
Yeah, and he was kind of. I think he wanted, because he's probably a scrawny little kid. He wanted to kind of build a little bit of badassness,
sure.
So, but one of the local papers in Raleigh, Durham, kind of labeled me that, and
it's always a journalist.
It's always a journalist.
Those bastards.
Obviously, it's if you're a marketer of anything, and I'm a marketer of myself,
sure.
and we all have a kind of a personal brand. I know that makes some people vomit a little bit, but I carry it forward a little bit. And I think what I love about it is I love startups and I love entrepreneurs. Probably actually not in that order. I love entrepreneurs and I love their companies. And if I could spend all day just talking with them, sharing my experiences, Everything from giving them business advice, which they can use or not use, and most of that is about sharing my experiences, to most of all, like talking about kind of the emotional and psychological aspects of it. I could do that all day long.
Yeah.
And so what I love about that label, the Startup Whisperer, is I am more than happy to discuss any piece of that, and not just kind of, chest puffery and flexing muscles and like, look what I did. No, I don't give a crap about that. Mm-hmm. To me, Mapquest is like being the high school quarterback.
Sure.
Like that's yesterday's news. What I have is a body of work and a body of observations and patterns I've recognized, and I love to share that. So maybe that's why I'm the whisperer.
I'm told you have a fascinating outlook on introductions.
Fascinating. Well, there seems to be two schools of thought, and maybe I'll give a little bit of benefit of the doubt to the people who don't believe what I believe.
Sure.
So fundamentally, let's just talk about what introductions are. Introductions are part of a community and how a community networks or gets connected. And I believe that's the secret sauce to everything. A well-connected, nice flat network, not a hierarchy, and you got to go through him to get to him, right? A networked community is a powerful community. You get more done with a network than you can, having to work a system. And so if you believe in network systems, a network approach, then I want as many people to be connected as possible. And sometimes, I don't know why, just like you two people should know each other. Go have a coffee. And you layer on that I think entrepreneurship is a team sport, not a solo sport. Mm-hmm. And to handle all those things I mentioned earlier, emotion, psychology, business advice, all that stuff, you need this network of people to draw upon. So my view, especially in, I think, developing or emerging communities, is when I think two people should know each other, I make an introduction. Joe meet Mary, Mary meet Joe, you guys should have coffee, see you later, bye. And they should trust in me, and I will trust in them that they'll figure this out. If Joe's busy, he said, hey, can we do 5 minutes over the phone? Great. If he feels like doing a lunch or a coffee, whatever their style, that's, their prerogative. Some people believe that introductions should be what I call double opt-in. Hey, Joe, do you mind meeting Mary? She's doing this, and this is what she wants. Okay. Hey, Mary, here's, and then once I get the approval of both, that, at that point, I want to cuss right now, like, just shoot me in the goddamn head, right? I don't have time for that. Yeah. I don't want to do that. That's friction. I call it network friction. And especially in emerging or developing community, I just think that's a waste of time. And we need to trust each other more and just value the connection. Now, that being said, there's a slight little bit of curation you could do. I happen to know the governor of North Carolina, and I've sat down with him a few times. If someone knows that and says, hey, can you introduce me to the governor? The answer is no. Yeah. What do you need? And I'll tell you the right person to go to.
There's 100 other people you need to speak to first before the governor.
So what I'm trying to do is not make this very judgmental and highly curated. Sure. Everything should be lightly curated. Anyway. What do you think about that?
I mean, there has to be an inherent trust of like, you know your lanes, and if you know within those lanes, like these two people should meet, it only seems natural that you should be the one to connect them.
Yeah.
And I think the double buy-in just it sounds very kludgy, so to speak,
like mechanical.
Yeah, it's like
transactional.
Yeah, it's like it's wasting unnecessary time.
So maybe a couple more seconds. I geek out on kind of this thing called networking, which I'd love to come up with a new word because it has a negative connotation, right? The problem with networking, why people hate it, is because most of the time we view it as a transaction. I need something from you, right? Yeah. And most of the time it isn't. Most of the time, let's just connect and share stories. And if there's something that we connect on, fantastic. If not, we're all the better. So I'd love as many people to be connected because I don't know where that spark, that serendipitous spark is going to come from. And again, back to kind of overlaying kind of a community on top of this. And in a developing or emerging community, we need more people to connect, and especially smaller ones. Like, I don't want to create any friction out of it. I want you guys to know each other, and what happens after that, who knows? So I just want to push that. Double opt-in just seems to be like maybe in New York City there could be more of a because it's very mature and there's lots of people, but in developing, let's just kind of eliminate double opt-in and smash people together.
So the moral of the story is folks in Buffalo and emerging cities, just connect people and meet them and move on.
I probably spend 15 to 20 minutes a day, whether doing 1 or 5 connections. Someone comes to see me, I say, listen, you need to talk to these 3 people. I make the introductions. I'm in and out. But like, we need more people doing that every day. It doesn't need to be controlled or engineered, right? It needs to be, we need to create a serendipitous opportunity for good shit to happen.
We're blazing through quite a few topics here because we're in a limited window of free time you have. One thing I wanted to ask you, just given your experience, over the last 20 plus years, can you share some of, like what's been your hardest day?
Well, I've had
There's probably been 100 of them, right?
There's been just as many as
right.
anybody else. Yeah. So requisite, failures and successes. So in Raleigh-Durham, partner and I stood up 2 Techstars inspired accelerators. These are, venture funds, micro funds, putting money into play with 3 months of mentorship. Great model. I love the model. I think it's a great community tool to kind of inspire more entrepreneurs. My partner and I, in our big fund, raised about $7 million, and that was kind of a 4-year window, and which is how you structure a fund. And so we got to the end of that. We're like, well, all right, we got to do more. And we realized that, we had learned some things. We learned that we needed to be a little bit different and a little bit bigger and operate kind of geographically larger, as well as having more capital to deploy in your winners. And that's how you, create great returns for a fund is after observing their behavior is kind of doubling down on the winners and kind of cutting short the ones that aren't going to make it. So we went out to raise $25 million, which is a pretty big jump, I guess, and thought we could handle it, and spent, almost a year raising the money. And we got about halfway there and just said, not good enough. Like, we're going all in or not. And, basically the market said, either we don't believe in you, or we don't believe in your idea, or this idea is not needed, or some combination of all those.
Sure.
That really sucked. I had spent 5-6 years running a couple different, micro funds, and now basically people are saying, not like this. Yeah, that sucked. Can you feel it?
So that happens. And obviously what's the big takeaway from that? You move on to the next thing?
You move on to the next thing, just like a good entrepreneur does. And I'll tell you, I tie these 2 things together in a nice little bow. I'm a big networker. I'm always connecting with people. I'm keeping those connections live and real, especially the ones that we share common interests. And 2 of those people that I just thoroughly enjoyed and kind of great professional friends were Brad Feld and David Cohen. If you're an entrepreneur and you don't know who those 2 people are, go look them up, especially Feld. 5 or 6 books and one of the best venture capitalists in the world, and you should go read all his stuff. But just networked out to them and said, I'm thinking about a couple ideas and love to come pick your brain. And the next thing you know, we're building a new business together, which is how do we build startup communities, not just startup companies? How do we build, help people build their community?
Which is something we're trying to do here in Buffalo. And you actually wrote a book called Build the Fort back in 2015. Can you give us a quick synopsis of why we should read that?
Nate, did you build forts as a kid?
I loved building forts as
Inside
a kid.
or outside or both?
Outside. Well, both, yeah.
Both.
Blankets over the couch and, with Star Wars on in the front,
exactly.
building my own little Death
Star. The broom
Star.
holding
Yeah.
I was more the outside guy.
Yep.
We had woods nearby. Built lots of forts, love building forts. One of the interesting things is that one of the original developers of Mapquest and I have worked together now 3 times. And whenever we kind of were sitting down, usually drinking beer, we'd start kind of riffing on an idea, and somehow, and it was probably him because he's more clever than I am, he would call this process like, all right, is it time to start building a fort? And one of the first things I'd say in this metaphor was like, all right, where are we going to steal the wood, right? Which is, if you're building an outside fort, you got to find wood. That metaphor was kind of our way of approaching the problem like a couple 10-year-olds. Because if you think about it, I'll juxtapose this really quickly. So you and I are 10, 12 years old. Like, remember what that's like. Like, we're in the same neighborhood. Hey, Nate, you want to build a fort?
Sure.
And you say, I didn't even finish the sentence.
Yeah.
You're like, sure.
Yeah.
You didn't go, so let's do the 35 to 45-year-old version. Hey, Nate, you want to start a company?
Well, why would we do that?
Yeah, and what's it going to be about? And where are we going to get the money? And right?
I got this thing.
Exactly. So
you were fearless at 10. You just did whatever the hell you wanted to.
Right.
And just,
And you hacked it
figured it out,
together,
yeah.
like we call those MVPs. Like we
Yeah.
did the lean startup
Yeah.
of building a fort, and we did what we were capable of doing. And some of them grew up to be really cool forts, and some of them lasted a day, right? And the notion of the book is like return to that 10-year-old thinking. And here's a couple ways to kind of, I think the scariest thing is making that first step. And I hope there's listeners out there that are thinking like, I'd like to start something, but man, I just don't know what my first 3, 4, 5 steps are. Go read the book, or come to 43 North, or go to Launch New York, or go. There's people out there that would love to hold your hand and just give you some a spirit of what it's like, and it's probably not as scary as you think it is. And so that's what the mission or the goal of Build the Fort is. Just say, hey, let me couch this in a framework that will make you smile, right? Oh yeah, I remember building forts. There's a great story about me building one of the forts. So that's the genesis of the idea. And there's also TED Talk.
So we can find that probably on the TED Talk YouTube page somewhere out there, right?
Just Google TEDx and my name, and
You'll find it.
If you're too lazy to read the book, you'll see the 18-minute TED Talk.
And you can, of course, find that book wherever books are sold, mostly Amazon these days. So it's really the only place besides... Yeah, it's the only
where else
bookstore.
would you go?
It's
You
the
know
only
you have to
bookstore.
go there.
Yeah, you have to go to Amazon.
Yeah.
Chris, I know we're out of time, but thank you so much. It's been a real honor chatting with you. And how can people continue to follow you if they're intrigued about all things Chris Heivly?
Sure. So I blog pretty frequently at www.heivly, Heiv as in Victor, ly.com. You can also, if you want to hang out for a while, I have a calendar you can get to, and I do 20-minute Google Meet, Skype kind of things once a week. So open office hours, anybody can sign up. And I'll also do a little tweeting on occasion. Like if you want to find out how I accidentally went to Canada.
It's a great story.
Piece.
It's a great story. Thank you so much again for helping us out with judging at 43 North Finals. It was a blast having you. And of course, we'll check in with what you're up to here in Buffalo further on down the road. So
sounds great. Thanks so much.
Cheers. I want to thank Chris so much for joining us on the podcast this week. It was a real pleasure to have him in the studio and just chat with him for the brief half hour that we had. I'm looking forward to bringing him back on the podcast sometime soon. And hey, make sure you submit your questions for him at podcast@43north.org so I can have those all ready to go for him. And make sure you send me a message about anything you want to hear on this podcast, whether it be a specific topic or a specific guest. This is your show. I'm just the host and the editor and the producer and the scheduler and all those things. Anyway, make sure you head on over to Apple iTunes and leave a 5-star review of this podcast, and make sure you share it with your friends. The more people who hear this podcast, the more people who learn about all the great things happening in Buffalo. And don't take my word for it. You just heard Chris talk about the startup ecosystem here in Buffalo, and I'm absolutely thrilled to just play a very small role in telling those stories. So again, make sure you reach out to me, podcast@43north.org, or hit us up on social media and leave us a request for what you want to hear on Latitude, the 43 North podcast. For 43 North, I'm Nate Benson, and we'll see you at the next one.